like I mentioned, we've had some pretty successful special operations missions here over the past year or so, but you can't get comfortable there. And it's hard to change, particularly when you've been successful. Usually you have to get punched in the face until we start to make a change. But how do you change when things are going well? But it is immediate. You have to do it. I talked to a former Delta Force operator. He said, I kind of think of my job as if I were given the task, hey, build an Echo Force that would make the Delta Force obsolete in 5 years. What would you do? And then we should start doing that today.
Was essentially all about. It was about violent change. It wasn't change on the back of success. It was change on the back of catastrophic failure. But it shows we can do it. It is possible to do it. You need disruptors and thinkers who throw everything up in the air and say, no, right, let's try doing this. And that getting comfortable thing is so dangerous, isn't it? That when you stop evolving, when you start feeling rather pleased with yourself, then you're in trouble.
Welcome to episode 160 of the Irregular Warfare Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Atwell. Today's episode explores the origins of Britain's World War II commandos and the enduring role of special operations forces from Churchill's era to today. To discuss this, I'm joined by two guests. Lieutenant General Scott Howell is a retired U.S. Air Force officer who served as the commanding general of the U.S. Joint Special Operations Command and the vice commander of U.S. Special Operations Command. Monty Halls is a former British Royal Marine who authored the book today's episode focuses on, titled Churchill's Killing House, The Origins of World War II's Legendary Commando Fighting Force. The Irregular Warfare Podcast is a joint production of the Empirical Studies of Conflict Project at Princeton University and the Modern War Institute at West Point, dedicated to bridging the gap between scholars and practitioners to support the community of irregular warfare professionals. You can find many more resources at www.irregularwarfare.org. Support for this episode of the Irregular Warfare Podcast comes from Hadean, an AI company focused on synthetic environments for training, planning, and decision support. Without further ado, here is today's conversation on the role of Special Operations Forces from World War II to today. Lieutenant General Scott Howell, Monty Halls, welcome to the Irregular Warfare Podcast.
Kyle, real pleasure to be here today, and I look forward to having a good conversation with you and Monty.
And thank you so much, gentlemen, for inviting me on. I'm really flattered and looking forward to the chat.
So today's episode focuses on a book that you wrote, Monty, called Churchill's Killing House, The Origins of World War II's Legendary Commando Fighting Force. Truthfully, the Irregular Warfare Podcast, we usually don't focus on history books. We look at international relations theory or policy research. And I learned a ton, and it was great to dig in a historical case study. So I'd like to start the conversation with you, Monty. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, it's an interesting one, Scott and Kyle, that I didn't actually want to write this book. And this will be an absolutely heretic statement on this podcast, but military history didn't really interest me. It didn't push my buttons, but my publisher was like, no, you need to tell this story, because my previous book was called Commando, Britain's Ocean Warriors, which is all about the modern role of the Royal Marines and the Commandos. And that had gone well. And my publisher said, the readers will want to know where all this comes from, where it stems from, where was the DNA braided for this organization? And so rather reluctantly, I started researching it and getting into it and diving into the books. And what happened is suddenly, and this will be a reflection in your own service as well, is I started recognizing the characters I was meeting as I did my research. And I suddenly realized there were manifestations of so many of the Royal Marines and SF community that I'd been fortunate enough to work with in my own career. And the story of those individuals and the way they came together in that remote house in Scotland to create military alchemy just made me realize this is such a special story to tell. And the final thing was, it hasn't been told. Inverrelying hasn't been told, the house. If you ask any Royal Marine where the Commandos come from, where it all originated, they'll say a different place, Achnacarry. But actually, it all started at Inverrelying. And the way I describe it is bad Hogwarts. It was like bad Hogwarts. It was like an academy of death, basically, because we were desperate. As a nation, we were desperate. So that was the reason. It was the characters that drew me in, really. And then it became a wonderful book to write.
So in the lead up to this episode, Scott, you and I were connected by somebody else. And I asked you, is there any book that you would like to discuss? And I assumed as a former SOF general, you would take it a lot of different directions, but you actually recommended this book. What led you to want to talk about this specific topic?
Great question, Kyle. And, I actually was introduced to the book by another former Royal Marine, Joe Carville, who's a good friend of mine. And we were chatting about this, having been fortunate enough to spend most of my career in the special operations community. I've always been fascinated. I love working with the Allies. I love seeing the DNA, as Monty mentioned earlier, where this all comes from. Where's the character of special operations built? And I learned a ton. I was not even aware of Inverell and the work that had been done there. But as you read through the book, I pulled threads out I recognize people, the personalities, the brashness, the audacity, and seeing how all that was woven together. And then going back and looking at, how some of our early Army Rangers trained as part of Scotland in 1942 or so. You can kind of see it all come together. But I love the history of the special operations community and seeing where those threads are that kind of lead us to where we are today.
Yeah, it's interesting. I teach a course at Georgetown, and one of the political science readings was on organizational culture. And the argument that the scholar was making is that when you set organizational culture, it's actually usually imprinted by the initial leaders of that organization. It's actually hard to change culture over time. So that resonates with what you're saying about you could kind of recognize some of what we have today in even contemporary U.S. SOF just by reading this story from over 70 years ago.
On that, so the Royal Marines dress uniform, as you may know, gents, is called Lovett's. And the reason it's called Lovett's is because of Lord Lovat, who set up Inverell House and led the Dieppe raid. He was only in combat for 6 days in World War II, but they were the most devastatingly effective 6 days imaginable. And he is at the heart of the commando ethos. And, we speak of our forefathers, don't we? We speak of our ancestors, our warrior ancestors, who set the standard and the culture for us that we carry forward to this day. Telling the story of the house and meeting the individuals, you suddenly realize, these were the people that did it. These were the people that wrote the charter that means we go about our business in a certain way nowadays.
I think it goes back to that piece about culture, knowing where we started, how we got here, and maybe think about how we can use special operations forces in the future. When I'm reading Monty's book and seeing about the boldness of these raids to actually enable the whole major joint force, it kind of gets me thinking about what are the future uses of special operations forces and how might we be more effective. We've been so, busy the last 20 years focused on just the counterterrorism, counterinsurgency piece. And I think they're a great role for special operations forces in more major combat operations. So the more we study the past, I think the more prepared we'll be for future challenges.
A big factor for me, Scott, looking at the situation we're in now, and the situation they were in 1939, 1940, it was easy to regard this as some brilliant tactical pivot by Churchill, who was always a fan of raiding. He always loved the concept of raiding. He was a front foot man. He wanted to be aggressive. And he actually said, we mustn't let the defensive mindset that's ruined the French have the same impact on us. We must be offensive. We must be on the front foot. So he was always a fan of it. But it was born out of necessity. It was born out of an existential threat to, Britain was this lump of rock moored off the coast of Europe, and Europe had fallen, basically. And we were waiting. So Dunkirk had just happened. The British Expeditionary Force had been routed in Norway. The British Expeditionary Force became known as BEF, became known as Back Every Fortnight. That was their nickname because it seems they always went and then they came back really quickly. So standard doctrines just weren't working. They just weren't working. And I do wonder, the way warfare is evolving so rapidly, and it's a big debate here in the UK in terms of not just our lack of funding, but our misdirection of the funding that we've got. And I wonder if we're at a similar phase of thinking, okay, we have to do something here. And that was the reason Inverell was set up. It was an act of desperation. We have to change the way we go about our business. And so we're going to get the outliers and the Fruit Loops and the eccentrics and the people who've always talked this slightly more extreme military language, and we're all going to put them together in a building and see what they come up with. And the result was the Commandos, the SAS, the SBS, the Paras, as you mentioned, Scott, the Rangers came and trained there, and the CIA took an awful lot of their lessons from what happened in that house. But it was an existential threat that required a desperate solution. And that's what Inverell was.
Yeah. And it was a really unique period of time there. Because, even on the United States side, about the same time, we started the Office of Strategic Services under General Wild Bill Donovan, and they were only in existence for 3 years from 1942 to 1945. But what an outsized impact they had. A lot built on what you had at Inverell and that type of organization. And even now, Special Operations Command and our Central Intelligence Agency all have ties back to the OSS and Wild Bill Donovan. It's actually his portrait hangs in both headquarters. So, there were a whole lot of common threads here. And it's like you said, how do you compensate? When you look at where Britain was in World War II, you didn't have mass to go on the continent of Europe and fight the Germans. And so how do you have an effect? And it's similar to the United States after we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. We had the Doolittle raid a few months later, just bombing against Japan because you felt like you had to do something and go on the offense and give the people of the United States something to cheer for. Kind of the same thing here with Churchill. Let's get out there and start mixing it up and show a little offensive spirit and put the enemy on their heels a bit.
Yeah, it's so true that, Scott, because it's a good expression that we didn't have the mass, we didn't have the number of people. So there are 338,000 people were evacuated from Dunkirk, and that's the basis of an army. But they left all their heavy weaponry on the beaches of Dunkirk. So we lost that element of a supported corps, as it were. So all we could do was raiding, and we didn't know how to do it. And hence Inverrylor being set up. And what's the role of special forces? Even nowadays, what's the role of SF or SOF is to disrupt and distract and annoy and be a huge psychological weapon when you're facing a much larger, more distributed enemy. The psychological impact, and that was identified very early on. There were two guys called Joe Holland and Colin Gubbins at a department called MIR, Military Intelligence Research in London. And Gubbins ended up heading up SOE, Special Operations Intelligence. But they both sat down at the start and said, okay, what are we trying to do here? Well, we're trying to mess with their heads. We're just going to mess with their heads. And Hitler was a notorious micromanager. And they knew that if they started doing these pinprick raids and they were really effective, psychologically it'd have a huge impact, but also Hitler would start to get involved, which is what happened.
That's interesting. Because of his personal involvement at the most senior levels, you might have an even more outsized impact with a tactical raid because you knew that the senior leader making decisions was listening. And that's actually one of the questions I wanted to ask is what was the main impact that these commando raids were designed to have? Was it military effects, political effects, or was it the psychological effects?
I'd say it's a combination of all three, Kyle. And initially, they were a disaster. So you learn through failure, don't you? And so the first raid was 2 weeks after Dunkirk. No one had done any training at all. And it was just a case of a bunch of good old lads who'd stepped forward and said, right, let's go and hit Guernsey, because Guernsey had just been occupied by the Germans. We're going to run ashore. We're going to shoot some Germans. We're going to take a bunch of prisoners, and then we're all going to come home for tea and medals, and it'll be fantastic. How difficult can it be? And as we all know, it is extremely difficult to do that well. And it was a litany of errors, that particular raid, farcical. And Churchill said at the end of that raid, let there be no more Guernseys. And that was one of the reasons that Inverrylor really came to the fore. Let's get the best people and train them up by the best people and create a different type of warrior, which is special forces essentially. But even the Guernsey raid was trumpeted in the British press as being a tremendous triumph, which struck back at the German war machine. And there were no German casualties at all in the Guernsey raid. And there was one round fired during that raid, and that was by the officer commanding the raid, John Durnford Slater, who tripped over and his Webley went off. That was the one round that the Commandos fired. John Durnford Slater went on to become a commando legend. But the psychological impact of these pinprick raids and this mythical creature called the commando was huge. And I often think, imagine being like a 19-year-old German sentry in the dead of night on the Atlantic Wall, and you know that out there somewhere are these people with burnt cork on their face creeping up the cliffs who can snatch you from your sentry position. The psychological impact on the Germans was massive. Hence the signing of the Commando Order in 1933 that said any special forces person caught is to be instantly executed. That's a manifestation of the impact that it had.
No, I agree, Monty. That's a great point. And like you mentioned, Kyle, was it military? Was it political? What was the goal here? And like Monty said, I think it goes across all of that. And the morale is a big piece of that. Not only the morale of the British to say, hey, we're on the offense again here, but also on the morale of the Germans. As Monty mentioned, that the memo that Hitler signed about the commandos, what outsized impact they have, tells you you're in the adversary's leader's head right then. When you also look at how Germany had to spread their forces across Europe to contend with after a few raids in Norway and other places like that, they have to compensate for that, which makes them weaker across the board strategically. So again, a really outsized effect.
This is one of the items we've talked about in some modern SOF operations is, we may not have a significant military impact as far as impact on the enemy, as far as the number of enemy that we remove from the battlefield, but we might divert masses of enemy forces away from the main fighting area, and that in itself could be an outsized impact. So that's interesting you're saying that, Scott, and I think that was one of the arguments in the book was that These raids didn't change the course of the war necessarily on their own, but what they did do is they diverted German forces across an increasingly spread line.
There's a very specific example of that, actually, and that's Norway. So there was a reason a lot of these commando raids took place in Norway. There's a place called Vassgøy that was raided on the 27th of December 1941, and that was the very first time where elite German troops had stood and fought against the commandos and lost. They were roundly beaten in Vassgøy. And that had a massive impact on Hitler. Hitler was quietly convinced that D-Day would happen through Norway. He thought that's where we would come in, through Norway. And so he diverted 30,000 troops from the Atlantic Wall to Norway when nothing happened. So when D-Day actually happened, they were sitting on their helmets, shivering, looking at an empty horizon when they could have been on the beaches of Normandy. So that's a very specific thing of, that commando raid on 27th of December in 1941 had this massive impact. He diverted battleships up there and all sorts. And that was a classic SF role of just creating uncertainty in your adversary's strategic mindset, because you haven't got, as you say, Scott, the critical mass to alter battles, but you can create real uncertainty. And that's such a powerful thing.
You try to get your forces always in a position of advantage. And when you see what the Brits had done against the Germans there and the uncertainty they had in the German mind, they were putting their forces in a position of disadvantage, out of position, and not able to respond in an appropriate way when the main assault comes. So I think the outsized impact of these commando raids was significant.
Churchill believed that small groups of highly trained volunteers could produce strategic effects out of proportion to their size. 80 years later, after everything we've learned in Afghanistan and Iraq and Ukraine, Scott, do you still think he was ultimately right?
I think he was. I mean, it's the boldness, it's the offense, it's the taking risk, and it's not only military risk, it's also political risk, was using some of the special operations forces with some of the more nuanced and precise things you want to accomplish. There's great political risk. And I think there continues to be a strong role for special operations forces even now across all the allies.
It's very interesting, Scott. Modern Royal Marines are pivoting again, a future commando force. So the Royal Marines commanders are classified as Tier 2 SF. So It's not Tier 1 SF, Tier 2 SF. And you were organized in companies, 120 strong, commander unit 600 or so. And now we're breaking that model down and actually looking at smaller teams of 10 or 12 of specialists who can operate almost completely independently. And that reverts to the original model that was established in Inverryle House, is taking very high quality people, training them up to a very high degree, and then giving them a level of autonomy in the field and the ability. And that was a big, big change of mindset, by the way. The reason we ended up in a situation like Dunkirk and the reason we ended up being defeated at every turn was a couple of things which will very much ring true to all of us at the moment. One was the British Army was defunded essentially between the wars and was stripped down to the bare minimum, and which obviously is an issue we're addressing at the moment. Meanwhile, we come up against a very well-equipped, very well-led, very motivated enemy with a clear doctrine, blitzkrieg, that we just had no answer to. But the big problem there, gents, as I'm sure you appreciate, is you then have to change the way you think. And if the way you think is based on hundreds of years of colonial superiority and coming up against, with the red squares and the tremendous discipline of the British Army and clear rank structure and clear ways of going about your business, you've got to tear that up and just get rid of it. That cultural change is a massive thing to take on. And throughout the war, these changes were opposed by senior members of the British Armed Forces. They were like, no, it's not British. It's not the British thing to do. No, we walk slowly towards the enemy, ideally wearing red jackets. And there's all this skullduggery and creeping around in the dead of night. That's what the opposition do, because we'd often come up against guerrilla forces because we had might on our side and a technically inferior enemy. And suddenly all that had to change. And that's why what happened in Inverryle, it was like heretic for so many people.
And you made a comment there earlier about how, the British military was not going to do this on their own. You have a culture of the British Army, the Royal Marines, the Royal Navy, Royal Air Force, and the same in our culture. The U.S. Special Operations Command was actually imposed on our Department of Defense over their objections. It was our Congress in 1986, 87 had the Nunn-Cohen Amendment, which established Special Operations Command because they thought, left up to their own devices, that the services are not going to take care of it and nourish this force. So, and bureaucratically, the services fought back against that. But again, it was a pretty visionary work by our U.S. Congress to impose U.S. Special Operations Command on the military.
Absolutely, Scott. And I think there's a really important point you make there. This only works if you have combined operations. It only works if you have all the services working together. And initially, there was a guy called Admiral Keyes who was put as head of combined ops. And he was a proper sulfuric old naval officer. He led the raid in Zeebrugge in World War I. He was a national treasure. He was in his 60s when he took on this role. And he rampaged around and upset absolutely everyone, annoyed all the other services. And so that didn't help at all. And then they got Lord Louis Mountbatten in. Lord Louis Mountbatten was this incredibly handsome, dashing, matinee idol of an officer, royal connections, but he was young and he was a junior rank. He was a naval captain. But he was brought in to head up combined ops. And one of his friends said to him, Dickie, you're so bent that if you ate a nail, you'd shit a corkscrew. That's what they said about him. Because he was so good at playing people off against each other. And actually, that's what was required. You needed someone who was Machiavellian, who could play all the different branches of the armed forces off not against each other, but just making sure they're all working together. And that's when combined ops really started to kick in. And that's when it became truly effective. When you got all the different arms aligned and you got the senior thinkers within those organizations aligned.
Yeah, you touched on a couple points I want to dig in a little bit more. First, I was surprised when reading this book that this was a new capability that the Brits needed because raids are not a new tool. I mean, they've been used forever, right? Raids are a key tool of warfare. And yet we had to build this new capability seemingly out of nothing is what I'm gathering from the book. And the conversation about the struggle that commando or guerrilla style or special operations forces have operating in a broader joint force where either for cultural reasons or maybe because of bureaucratic politics and resource fights, they're not always welcome. Scott, do SOF still have to fight this fight or are we established enough that SOF have their clear role within the services and it's no longer a bureaucratic challenge just to stay alive?
That's a great question, Kyle. And I think it continues. It kind of waxes and wanes. I think, with the establishment of Special Operations Command and the performance of our SOF forces over the past 25 years, I think we're pretty well established. But now there's a little tension. What do we do for the next type of conflict? And maybe less about raids and things like that. It's what can we do to enable the joint force? So while there's always a big push to take care of and nurture SOF, we also need to embrace our ties back to our service cultures. I mean, as an AFSOC airman, I have a tied culture to our Air Force and also to Special Operations Command. I think that makes us better. So I think continuing the conversation of SOF in the joint force and what the service is going to be key. Thankfully, as I mentioned earlier, we've had Congress impose us. So we've had a good congressional oversight, nurturing and looking after the SOF community. We have our own Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict. That helps as well. I get a seat at the table on the policy side. So it's something we always need to continue to watch. So
I can just imagine when the Department of Defense was told and the service was told, you will build this thing, just the kind of anger that happened in the hallways of, we don't need you to tell us how to do our job. So that's super interesting.
That's exactly right.
I think that struggle for justification, you have to justify, you're quite expensive. There's a lot of assets go into you and a lot of training time. You've got to justify your existence. Bear in mind that after World War II in 1946, those were disbanded. They were like, right, that's it, don't need you anymore. We're done. And then they came back together in 1950 with the Royal Marine Commandos. And that's when the Royal Marines really took it all on with 4-1 Commando for Korea. But yeah, once the war was over, it's so interesting, isn't it? The thinking of politicians frequently is like, well, we're done now. We've done. Yeah, well done. Well done, everyone. Right, off you go. We don't need you anymore. There's always that thing, well, it might happen again at some point, do you think? So I don't want to oversimplify it, but maybe there is a bit of a mindset.
I'd like to pivot to the characteristics and training required to build these types of units. And I was going to start with the tactical level, what the training looked like for these soldiers whose mission and only desire was to kill Germans. But you brought up an interesting point, Monty, which was what was needed on the political level from the senior leaders of this unit to keep it alive was maybe as important as what was happening at the tactical levels. And you mentioned this Machiavellian approach to politics. what was needed from senior leaders within this organization. And I often wonder if a senior leader needs to be political in these types of organizations. Does that actually work against what is valued at the tactical level, at the things that we're brought up to do as junior officers and junior NCOs?
So I'm going to read between the lines of my own book here, because what was obviously needed was isolation. What was needed was, right, let's just find somewhere we can quietly get on with this. And the War Office, I describe it in the book as the red tab dilettantes of the War Office, won't really know what's going on. We're going to operate in isolation here. Hence, Inverryle, in the restricted zone on the west coast of Scotland, it is utterly in the middle of nowhere. So they had their own fiefdom, and they could impose whatever training rules and regulations they could like. Hence, use of live ammunition from day one. Right, we're going to use live ammunition. They killed 40 people during the course of training. Commando
At the training house, they killed 40 people.
Inverryle and Achnacarry, 40 people were killed. And so they were like, right, this is gloves off, this is bare knuckle stuff. So they needed isolation to make that happen. But they also needed politicians. And in that, they had Colin Gubbins, they had Joe Holland, who were based in the War Office and were huge fans of this. But they also had Lord Louis Mountbatten, and they had Brian Mayfield, a guy called Brian Mayfield. All of these characters who occupied that house were incredibly unconventional and were real disruptors. In the modern world, we'd think of them as disruptors. They tore up the rule book and said, right, we're going to do it our way, and our way is going to be different. But you need a politician, don't you? You need someone who can kind of oil the wheels. And in Brian Mayfield, he was 42 years old. He was an ex-Royal Engineers officer, and he was a more traditional commanding officer. And so he'd go down to the War Office and say, oh, no, it's all fine. It's all perfectly normal. It's just a perfectly normal infantry setup we've got up there. Meanwhile, they're running amok in the house, muffled explosions from around the house and figuring out how to do stuff. But happily, they did end up with the perfect combination of people there. And Scott, you touched on it earlier. They went beyond the military world, and they used polar explorers and great mountaineers and gillies and stalkers from the estates. What do? They creep up on a skittish quarry and dispatch it with one shot. So they were like, right, let's get them in. But you do need that conventional link, the politician, I think. And then they had Mayfield doing that and Mountbatten as well for them.
Yeah, same in our community. So when you go back and read about the training and how they selected people, it's really about how do we measure grit? And so they're taking people and measuring grit. And, all of our special operations tribes, if you will, have their own assessment and selection program and how we get the people right. And it's, we have in U.S. Special Operations, we have what we call the soft truths. The number one soft truth is humans are more important than hardware. So we're not recruiting a technician, a person who can work a first-person drone, for example, in today's challenges. It's about finding the right person who has that level of grit, and then he can figure out how to use the tools that are out there. So, it's the selection of those men at Inverryle and what they became, I think, was just astonishing. When you look at this, the same things we've had in our special operations community. It's about getting the input pipe right. If you get the right people coming in, you're going to get the right product at the end. But it's finding that level of character and grit and audacity and a good sense of humor. You see all that. But then, as you mentioned, Monty, you also have to have parallel the same kind of bureaucratic maneuvering political wise. These guys may be isolated and doing some intense training, but they have to have budgets, and they have to be used. They have to be known that it's a tool you can use in the toolkit. So there's a little bit of an insurgency on the political side, as well as building insurgents at the training side.
It's a very interesting point, that, Scott. So a few years back, the Royal Marines commissioned an anthropologist to come and study them as a tribe. What an interesting idea. And this guy is from the University of Exeter, and he studied the organization as a tribe. And you use a very interesting expression there, Scott, the sort of soft skills. Did you say soft skills? Was that or the soft?
Well, the soft truths.
Soft truths. Great expression. Yes. Yeah. Great expression. Because at the end, he said the vast majority of rules that this organization runs by are unwritten. They are a code of conduct that the organization within itself has agreed about the way they behave and the standards they uphold. But his final conclusion was, above all, the Royal Marines asked their members to endure. That was his final conclusion. I agree with that ability to endure, keep going through circumstance, through change, through, and adapt and evolve and overcome and all those other good expressions. But I thought that was a really interesting conclusion. Above all, they asked their members to endure.
It's a great point. And it's,
Yeah.
it's that never quit mentality. And we still see it now, even in all our little tribes, our special forces has their own selection and assessment program. Our SEALs do theirs kind of in boat crews. And how do you work as a team? There's some other of our units who go on, all individual long walks under load. How do you perform? And just, how do you measure the right kind of grit for those folks? But it's amazing when you get that right nucleus of talent and character, kind of what you can produce. And I think that, going back to the work that was done at Inverilo is a perfect example of that.
Yeah. So I was going to ask about the characteristics you need of individuals, and the story you're telling is it comes down to grit, audacity. I would add initiative, having been on staffs for a couple of years now and understanding how few staff officers actually take the initiative to solve problems on their own, which I think aligns with those other characteristics. And I love the idea that this is a timeless set of characteristics that we're looking for. It's not just something that applied to World War II. But I'd like to push back a little bit on what else is needed, because as you mentioned earlier, Monty, the first few raids you describe are generally failures. They're actually pretty catastrophic failures. And there was not for a lack of grit and audacity. In fact, their audacity involved may have led to outsized losses because they were boldly charging into very terrible situations, or they were boldly charging into situations that actually had no intelligence backing them. So I'd like to push beyond that raw ingredients, which are probably necessary, to what are some of the other lessons that these units need to be able to succeed?
Lots of people volunteered or were sent there by their commanding officers. They sent a lot of troublemakers there, and people who loved brawling and people who had a criminal record. And they didn't last long at all, as we all know. But I very much agree. They were looking for that ability to think outside the box, to show initiative, to operate independently, to think left field, to absorb technology very quickly. These were demolitions experts. They had to be signalers. They wanted to train the whole man.
Yeah, something that really stood out in the book, and I've seen this in contemporary special operations units, is some people take too much pride in the idea of being an outlier, of being a renegade and a rogue, and they actually completely throw discipline and good order and conduct aside in a way that just makes them complete disasters. And I think that you very well articulate in the book that you need some of this out-of-the-box, unconventional thinking, but that doesn't mean you're undisciplined, because actually units, any type of unit, can't operate if you don't have basic discipline.
Yeah. I loved your point in the book, talking about the training in Inverilo, and it's the dislocation of expectation during training, which it's something new. What do you expect it's going to be unpleasant training, but it's what is coming next? And you don't really know. You know it's going to be tough. And so how do you get that grit? And so what you develop is a group of people who not only have grit, but they're comfortable being uncomfortable. And I think that also makes them successful bureaucratically, because if you're on the staff, you're right, Kyle, earlier, your point is not a whole lot of staff officers show a lot of initiative. But when you have people with this level of grit and they're comfortable being uncomfortable, they're happy to push the bureaucracy and kind of see where it goes. And there's a risk of action. We talk about risk a lot. There's also a risk of inaction. And so sometimes you have to highlight that to get things moving forward.
Gents, can I ask both of you a question? You have much more experience of SF than I do. I got involved in a really interesting exchange, a really interesting debate with a few friends of mine who were SF. And we were talking about what happened in Afghanistan when certain units had gone off the rails. And there were certain individuals, there was a bit of rogue behavior, et cetera, et cetera. And they were asking me about that. And I said, well, the interesting thing is that they were asking on the perception of historically, did that happen? And I said, well, be aware that the people organizing this training at Inverilo and this new type of soldier were called Lord Lovat and Bill Sterling, who was obviously joint founder of the SAS. He was an aristocrat, and there was still this societal hierarchy going on. And Lovett was famous for having incredibly high standards, morally as well. And if anyone and so was Durnford Slater. If anyone stepped outside that, did something wrong, was discourteous to someone weaker or whatever, or was abusive, they were gone. They were just gone. And do you feel that society has lost that a little bit, and that might manifest itself in the young men and women coming through occupying those special forces roles now that perhaps don't have the barriers and the boundaries that did exist back in the day? Do you think that's a thing?
I think it can be a thing. And I think anytime you have a group of humans, you're always going to get something wrong. and you're going to pick the wrong people. But in the main, I think we're in pretty good shape. It's always amazed me when everyone talks about the next generation. Now they're not quite as strong. I read an article about the World War I generation talking about how weak the Americans were that were going to World War II. Our greatest generation. Everyone thinks the people coming in behind them are a little softer. I don't see that. I mean, when I was still involved with the Rangers and the SEALs and the Green Berets, that level of grit exists. Those people are out there. It's just a matter of finding them, picking them, and put them in the right environment to kind of keep that culture going. But it's always a concern because, you need credibility equals freedom of maneuver. And if you don't have the credibility, if you've got behavioral drift there, if you don't take care of it on their own, you're going to lose what makes you special.
Yeah, I'll take a step too. I mean, I think for the current system we have in the U.S. SOF, meritocracy works. And for the Green Beret community, getting in, it's an incredibly meritocratic system. So anybody can apply to go to selection. You don't wear a rank when you're at selection. You are rated by your peers based on your performance, on your contribution to the team. And then even once you're on a Green Beret team, it's a small team of 10 to 12 people. And the culture is the best idea wins. The leaders, the captains who come in as the officers, the ones who do well are the ones who take the best idea from the team and not assume that their idea is the best. So I think we're in a good place because the best rise up. However, I would say in response to what you said, Monty, that leadership is absolutely essential. And the challenge with SOF is you are trusting. You are saying, we're not going to micromanage you. We're going to send you out to be alone and unafraid. And we're going to hope you have the discipline to do the right thing and to understand what rules don't apply. And the problem is if you don't have a strong leader who can keep the team in the line, they're going to go rogue. And so the leadership, I think, is even probably more important in these decentralized units we send out to operate on their own than it would be in other type of units that are more hierarchical in nature.
Completely agree. You've got to get the right level of maturity and experience there. We in our special operations community, Monty, we're very bottom up driven. Like Kyle said, we are not going to kind of impose, tell them how to do a raid, for example. The people who are going to live and die by the decisions made on target should be the ones making those decisions. So we let them develop the plan, and each successive layer of headquarters just provides more support and gives them the ability to maneuver. And so, the leadership needs to start at the bottom, and it does. And I think the constant assessment, the constant after-action review, the constant evaluating, do we do this right, is what keeps that blade sharp.
That's good to hear. And interestingly, Kyle, you mentioned the thing of everyone training together, rank being, just not an issue. It's your performance during the course of your training and selection. That's what happened at Inverilo. And that was, again, I keep using the word heretic, but that was heretic in the British Army. Good grief, where you bought your commission and it was Lord Bufton Tufton with blah, blah, blah. Suddenly you're training with the men, going through everything they go through. Love it, demanded higher standards from the officers than from the men in everything. And that was, as a mindset shift, that was absolutely massive. To your point about the modern manifestation of special forces and the commandos, etc., I interviewed Julian Thompson, who commanded 3 Commando Brigade down in the Falklands. He's a wonderful, wonderful man. And I said, what do you think of the modern Royal Marines compared to the guys you led in 1982? Do they compare to you? And he thought for a moment, and he's your archetypal British senior officer. Wonderful, dry, great sense of humor, formidable operator, great intellect. And he went, no. He said, they aren't comparable with us. They're much, much better. So, which was really great to hear. Yeah.
I completely agree, Mike. That's great. And every time I'm out engaging with people still in active duty force, the level of thought they have strategically, but they understand what's going on internationally, politically. They know their tactical tasks. They know how to tie strategic to tactical. It is amazing what they're thinking about, how to incorporate new technologies. Way more creative than I was as a young officer.
I'd like to pivot us to the last part of the conversation, which is what is the role of special operations forces today? I keep reflecting on the idea that some of these missions were not successes. Some of them were great successes, sometimes because they got into the head of the enemy, sometimes because there was actually kinetic effect against the enemy. And as I was reading each raid and the details of it, I kept thinking, what is the appropriate use of special operations forces today? I think we see examples around the world where countries don't always use them well. They just use them as infantry with night vision goggles, essentially. And then other ones reserve them for very special missions. What lessons can we take from this story for the appropriate and inappropriate use of SOF?
I would argue that the role that they had in World War II is very, very similar to the role that they have today. And that role is to disrupt and distract and create an element of doubt and divert resources and create mythology in the minds of the enemy. And that's exactly what this group did, exactly what the Commandos did. They had a number of very effective raids where they operated in quite large numbers, up to 500 in some of the raids. But they drove Hitler to distraction. So the final raid in the book is Dieppe. Now, Dieppe was a disaster. 4,000 people killed in Dieppe, assaulting the main beach. It was an absolute disaster. But the guns either side of the beach were taken out by commandos, number 4 commando, number 3 commando. And that's all Hitler thought about after Dieppe. He was like, well, these mythical figures appeared and took the gun batteries out. And so I'd say that role of, it's almost a mythological role. When I think of a US Green Beret or Delta Force, I think of a mythical figure. You think of SAS and they're mythical figures. And there's a reason for that. And that creates doubt and confusion in the minds of an enemy. So I would say that role of punching above your weight and wreaking havoc and diverting resources is as powerful now as it's ever been.
Yeah, I would agree, Monty. It's about the outsized effects of what a small unit can have. I get concerned sometimes about maybe the over-reliance on special operations forces. It's easier politically to put a small team somewhere than to put a large force. So sometimes it might be, hey, let's just do that with a raid. And, we've seen our special operations community in the United States have great success here lately. Look most recently at Venezuela and the raid there. What a brazen raid to go into a nation's capital and take out the head of state and his wife. My goodness. You talk about bold to do that. But, every time you have success like that, there's a tendency to, hey, let's go back to those guys again and go to the well. But there's accrued risk over time. One of the advantages of successful special operations missions is having tactical surprise. And in today's information environment, it's much, much harder to gain that tactical surprise. And, my concern is, with all the ubiquitous information out there and the warning and everybody on social media, can you really achieve that tactical surprise? And so that will be something I think is a real key tenet to successful special operations forces. It gets more and more challenging as we go. And it may not be a raid. It could be the precise use of influence at a certain part with a certain foreign leader. It could be having placement access to place a technical tool somewhere to gather information. It may not be, this violence. There's a whole lot of very precise uses for special operations forces beyond the raids.
So 2 things that stood out from what you guys just said. First, these were raids in World War II that were in support of a broader strategy. And it's interesting, Scott, that you said there may be a risk that raids become the strategy because they essentially become the easy button or because they're sexy or because they're cheap. So that's an interesting point. The other thing is that the raids that we're talking about, the use of commandos and special operations forces in the book in World War II are raids in support of large-scale combat operations and conventional forces. And so there's really been 2 big changes that have happened over the last 5 years or so. First is the geostrategic environment has changed. So we went from a focus on this global war on terror, where a lot of our soft forces were working by, with, and through partner forces, or they were working in places like Afghanistan. And then the second big change is technology, just massive changes in technology and how that impacts the warfighter. So a question I'd ask you, Scott, is given the changes in geopolitical threats and also changes in technology, are there changes in the types of missions that SOF need to do? And are there also changes in the capabilities that we need to be building? Is there a commando force that needs to be built to adapt to this new world?
Absolutely. I mean, and I think, if you pick the right people, you could train them in this. But, we in the U.S. military, it's taken us decades to really coordinate our maritime, our land, and our air forces together in a joint campaign. Well, now we have to incorporate space and cyber and all the other tools out there. So you need operators in these special operations unit who are articulate on cyber. How can I use a cyber tool? Maybe I need to put a person in harm's way because we can do this via cyber. So having someone who can take all this in and synthesize it and say, how does this make us a better fighting force is going to be key. So it's harder and harder, I think, for the young operators to understand what's going on. And again, like I mentioned earlier, when I talk to some of these young officers and NCOs, I'm amazed at how informed they are on international security challenges, on technology, how they might use it. But that's going to become even more and more difficult.
I think there's a lot of good things happening in the transition, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on what is the area of greatest concern when you look at how the SOF community is transitioning to the new environment?
It's a good question. I know that Admiral Bradley, the current SOCOM commander, is really stressing ties back to the services. I think in any future large-scale fight, like Monty mentioned, it's going to be how do we enable the joint force? So how do you strengthen those ties back to your services while also maintaining a cohesive joint force under SOCOM. That will be a challenge, making sure they have the right equipment. I'm amazed that when you show these young folks a piece of tech, they'll figure out a use case that, I never would have thought of on their own. So it's how do you harness that creativity and keep nurturing it? That will be the challenge.
We've had our veterans minister recently, who's a former Royal Marine called Al Kearns, and Al's resigned because of the defence review. Not enough money's going to be allocated to defence, et cetera, et cetera. And he's SF, he was SB, and he made an interesting point. He was like, we got to change. We got to change. We're facing a period of massive flex coming up. And he has this real concern that we're dragging our heels. And the procurement process, everything is too slow to create the change we need really rapidly. And the example he used, he said, I can train a Royal Marine it takes 1.25 years to train a Royal Marine and get him to commando standard. And then, off he goes and does his business. Or I can train my 14-year-old son in 2 weeks to take out a series of targets 40 kilometers away using drones. And he said, it's changed. Everything's changed. And we need to accept that. And we need to flex and adapt and evolve. It's always changed, doesn't it? But it's changing so rapidly. And I think that's one of the concerns certainly we have here in the UK of trying to get up to speed with that.
It's the same with us, Monty. So when like I mentioned, we've had some pretty successful special operations missions here over the past year or so, but you can't get comfortable there. And it's hard to change, particularly when you've been successful. Usually you have to get punched in the face until we start to make a change. But how do you change when things are going well? But it is immediate. You have to do it. I talked to a former Delta Force operator. He said, I kind of think of my job as if I were given the task, hey, build an Echo Force that would make the Delta Force obsolete in 5 years. What would you do? And then we should start doing that today. So it's always questioning yourself and making sure you're doing the right things is what's going to keep it. And it's that being comfortable, being uncomfortable, and recognizing the need for change, even when things are going well.
Yeah. And I think the sort of final thing on that for me, Scott and Kyle, is, again, that's what the book was essentially all about. It was about violent change. It wasn't change on the back of success. It was change on the back of catastrophic failure. But it shows we can do it. It is possible to do it. You need disruptors and thinkers who throw everything up in the air and say, no, right, let's try doing this. And that getting comfortable thing is so dangerous, isn't it? That when you stop evolving, when you start feeling rather pleased with yourself, then you're in trouble. You're in real trouble.
That's exactly right. Yeah. It's a wonderful book, Monty, just seeing the type of people they brought together, that the type of change they were driving, and it was driven by them. It wasn't imposed. I love the whole culture piece. And, I felt like I knew a lot of these people as I started reading about them, because I know characters like that I was privileged to serve with.
Well, there's some good research that shows pretty convincingly what you guys were just talking about, which is that military organizations change very rapidly when the price of failing to adapt is blood, and they don't change so well when they're actually in a peacetime scenario. Just the rate of change doesn't happen so quickly. And so I think that's why we have this saying that doctrine is written in blood, but we have an opportunity now to learn in peacetime, hopefully rapidly, knowing that one day we'll have to pay in blood if we can't figure it out now. I'm going to pivot to the closing question, which is, what are the implications of this conversation for practitioners and policymakers?
I would say don't ignore your outliers. Innovation is always painful and change is always difficult, and maintaining the status quo is always easier, but it comes at tremendous risk. And if we had in World War II as a nation stayed the same and kept doing the same things with our armed forces, particularly the army, our ground forces, we would have been in an absolute world of trouble. And I think if there's one lesson for us today from this book, it's use your disruptors, give them freedom of thought, encourage them, and see what a lot of the stuff Scott said about, I love that thing about an Echo Force. Okay, let's make an Echo Force. What a fantastic mindset that'd be. And I think that's the big lesson for me. And the frightening thing is you see so many in the build up to Dunkirk, you see so many of the things, history kind of repeating itself nowadays. And I just hope we've got the flexibility and the sort of, the ability to use those disruptors that we may need.
And I would say for the policymakers is get to know these forces and go talk to them, visit them, see what they're capable of. They're happy to show you that, and you'll walk away impressed at what you have. When Jim Mattis was Secretary of Defense, he said, protect your mavericks. You got to protect that level of thinking and that level of action. So they'll have to be protected and kind of nurtured. So for policymakers, like as I mentioned earlier, our congressional oversight committees have done a good job of protecting SOF at times when they were under threat. So don't let that pendulum swing back the other way again, will be the point I'd like to highlight.
Lieutenant General Scott Howell, Monty Halls, this has been a great conversation. Thank you for coming on the Irregular Warfare podcast.
Hey, Kyle, thanks for having us. This was a great conversation. And Monty, thanks to you, one, for the book. I know it's a tremendous amount of work, but I drew so many great points out of this and lines to our current special operations forces in the United States and how we grew. So really, thank you for coming on today and sharing your thoughts and for the book.
And well, Jones, from my side, the best conversations are the ones where you learn loads as well. And it's been really, really interesting chatting to both of you. So again, thank you so much for having me on, and thanks so much for your kind words.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of the Irregular Warfare Podcast. If you like the show, please spread the word and consider sharing this episode with others. You can subscribe to the Irregular Warfare Podcast so you do not miss an episode. You can also engage with us on X, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and across many other platforms. If you found value in today's conversation, please leave us a review on Apple Podcast. It really helps us reach new audiences. And one last thing, what you heard in this episode are the views of the participants and do not represent those of West Point, Princeton University, the Irregular Warfare Initiative, or any agency of the U.S. or any other government. Thanks again for being part of this community, and we'll see you next time.